morning or good
Hi,
evening.
everyone.
Hi. I've put some highlights in the in our meeting notes, but please feel free to add topics that you want to discuss about today. Let's wait just 1 or 2 minutes to see if more people can join. think we can get started. So, hi everyone, thanks for taking time to joining the Catalog Community Sync. So today I would like to take the first several minutes to go over what has been added to the REST back over the last 3 weeks. So first we have the enable row lineage metadata updates get into the spec. So this is to enable the row lineage, which is a feature added in V3. Thanks, Russell, for doing that. And second is that we will now have the initial defaults and write defaults updated to the schema model in the REST spec. Thanks, Dan, for adding that. And then we deprecate the snapshot ID of the set statistics update because I think that's not unnecessary information. So thanks, Christian, for doing that. And finally, we have e-tag and if not match headers added for the table loading. So this is a way that you can know if the table is fresh or not. So thanks, Gabor, of doing that. And we also have some ongoing spec changes. The one we have is the remove schemas update, which is currently voting on the dev list. So I encourage everyone to take a look at it and vote if you have not done yet. And finally, just call for the PR review for the auth manager's PR. I think this is the part 6 would be the last piece to get that in. Alex, please correct me if I'm correct. Oh. Yeah, so these are the updates over the 3 weeks, and so if anyone have any comments or have anything wants to discuss, please feel free to call it.
Can I add a couple things? I know that the register table with a force option came up on the mailing list. And I think we should probably revisit the discussions around notifications because we're seeing those suggested on the Iceberg mailing list, even though it's not part of the spec. So we should get something for that use case into the spec so that we have compatibility across REST implementations. Not sure what the status of that was. I know we were discussing push versus pull and other things, but it would be good to start revisiting this and get it, basically come to some agreement on how we're going to do this across catalogs.
Hey, Christian, I don't know if you have any late thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, so maybe from my side, so for us, one of the most important use cases of Fed, or one of the most important use cases that we also discussed, partial loading of tables for is already covered with what we now have in e-tags. So because we can already know if a table was refreshed or not. Regarding the notifications API, I haven't put any more thought into this after our last discussions, which was a little bit, I think we had the proposal from the Polaris side where we had this pull-based approach and then push-based approach basically. So the catalog exposes the notifications API. Yeah, so I'm not sure if there are any new developments there, but yeah. So
yeah, I think from our perspective, I know that initially we had talked about the pull based versus the push based.
Yeah.
Is there any opposition to continuing with an actual push based mechanism, or do you think that that's going to be good enough to satisfy your use cases?
So for this YOLO API, I think that is good enough. I guess one of my biggest complaints about that is that vendors can say they're REST compatible without actually implementing the push-based part of it, right? So like everybody wants to own metadata, and if we just have the notification endpoint which we can push to, then nobody is really forced to implement federation while still being 100% REST compliant, right? So this was one of the reasons why I thought maybe a pull-based approach was better having that in the API. So I still kind of favor these kinds of approach, but I don't want to stand in the way of the community basically to implement a push-based approach if this is what everybody else wants. And I think there are also very good reasons for push-based approaches. We discussed, for example, like getting this YOLO endpoint out from Hive meta stores, just injecting a little piece of code there, telling the Iceberg REST catalog that an update happened and so on. Yeah.
So I think there are good technical reasons for a pull-based as well. Like one is what happens if for some period of time you are disconnected and you miss the push-based view of the world. If you're assuming that you get every single push, then tables can be out of date.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a very good argument around having a pull-based mechanism to essentially backfill anything that you missed as well and ensure that you didn't miss anything.
Yeah. Yeah, like this was exactly also my point that I argued, I think, in one of the last meetings to that, saying that I see various challenges for push-based approaches if we want to have eventual consistency. So, but if we get rid of this requirement, then we can implement something push-based, which is how I guess we came to the YOLO discussion. And I'm like, my original intention for this was to be more of a federation mechanism which is eventual consistent, which got me to the pull-based approach. So basically, a client just stores a pointer, pretty much like what Robert just wrote in the chat, Kafka approach. The client just needs to store this pointer and then can request changes starting from this pointer, fetch them, and then the catalog needs to store every change that happens for a specified number of time, and then it can get rid of it. Yeah.
So I think that makes sense. That actually makes it so that we can design something idempotent as well, so that push notification is like, hey, something changed, right? But then the actual content of that change is pulled from, like a catalog event stream or something like that. I think I would definitely prefer that design. It sounds like there's some agreement from Robert and possibly others. So what are the sorry, I was just bringing this up as a topic, and I realized we just dove straight into the last topic on the list, so I apologize there. But like, what would the next steps on like that design be? I guess I posed a question, but Robert has his hand up, so I'll
yeah, I just wanted to. I mean, I wrote in the chat. I'm in favor of a pull-based approach. I mean, what Christian said with the token, where you can start back and go on. You can always build something push-based on top of that. But I think push-based requires a lot of state on the server side, and that could be tricky to implement. And I think pull is, at least from the start, easier to implement and start with.
I agree with that, and I think that the push-based is better served when we have this pull-based mechanism, so that you can do the YOLO like push, and then you can make sure that you get all of the changes from the last time that you pulled, and then the push-based becomes simply a mechanism to avoid polling.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the next steps then would be, so actually, I didn't follow up on this topic last time because I felt the pushback in this meeting was so big, and everyone was trying to to get to the pull-based approach, that I didn't see a chance for it. But I'm happy to draft up something and just hand it in. And then in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I guess, so that we can discuss in the next catalog sync.
That'd be awesome. I think sometimes you find that as we all take a step back and then think about it for a few weeks, sometimes our positions change as we think about these things more, and think about the arguments. So thanks for volunteering.
Sure.
Just a quick clarification question. When we say that we will pull the changes since the last pull, does it mean that we're keeping a log on the server, like which will, if for a large data set, there'll say thousands and millions of tables?
Yes.
It will not become too noisy for each. Okay, perfect.
Yes. The thing is that even to implement a push-based approach, you would also need to do this. And because you would need to implement something like a transactional outbox pattern, right? If you wanted eventual consistency. So on the server side, actually not that much changes. You would need to keep that log anyway for a certain amount of time.
Question is, do we need a eventual consistency?
Well,
so this is why it was called the YOLO approach right now. Like it's, you're firing off changes, and whatever state happens to get collected is whatever that state happens to be on the other side. And so I think there may be cases where that's sufficient, but in the spectrum of like full consistency to YOLO, there may be a good balance in there where it may be eventually consistent, or at least you might have some way of knowing where you are in terms of the overall consistency story across your catalog.
Yeah, I think so. I agree on the consistent, a little bit more consistent guarantee on the pull base, because you basically go to the source of truth to get the latest one, which is a big benefit when we compare it to the push base, right? Is the major decision point like we wanna this one instead of like notification like push based one? I'm missing the first part. Sorry about that. Maybe,
I'm sorry, I was writing in the doc.
Yeah, maybe Christian. Yeah, Christian or Ryan has more context. I saw you discussing a little bit. So the question, let me reiterate my question. So when we talking balance between the push based and pull based, and there's one things come up, which is pull based will be a little bit better position in terms of the consistent, because you can connect to the current table on the remote catalogs, and you always get the consistent view of that. And a push base, you just get what you get. Like you don't have any control of that, which I agree. I'm just checking, is there any other decision point when we compare two approach? This is very strong reason, I guess. At least in my point of view, it's a very strong reason to kind of reach at least more consistent than the push-based approach.
Yeah, I think so. Like if you want to build something that actually reliably syncs state, you would either have to, like Christian is talking about, have a transactional mechanism where you keep track of the changes that have been acknowledged, or like where you got a 200 back from the push, right? Or you would need to keep a, you would need to move to the pull based. And so, I think we're all in agreement that like the pull based is probably the right way to do that, with push based being a, notification that there was a change, so you don't need to continuously pull the endpoint, and maybe some information about that change, but you don't actually like rely on that for correctness. I think that's probably a good way to go. That also, I also think that the pull based has a lot of value in that, like, you would be able to basically have this event log of changes happening on your service that could be used to drive things other than foreign catalogs as well. So it could be that like, oh, hey, I see that this table was updated. And so for like, I know Polaris, you guys are working on table maintenance, right? If you have a separate table maintenance service, then that could also be fed by the events coming off of that pull-based plugin.
Yeah, just wanted to say that is exactly the target of Polaris, using the notification endpoints to update and trigger the TMS when it's needed. So that's completely aligned.
Like maybe we probably already collected enough arguments, but one more argument for me is usability. So a push-based approach always needs to be configured on both sides. So you have to configure the receiving end, providing a catalog where it needs to sync into, and then you have to configure the push end, because you need to tell, I don't know, Snowflake to push changes into Polaris. And with a pull-based approach, this is much simpler. You only configure the receiving end, so the catalog which gets federated in, and that's it. And you can have multiple federated catalogs, all configured that way. Robert?
Yeah, fully agree. I mean, implementing a push-based approach is way more complicated and requires a lot of state on both sides. The question is, what's the payload of the events? Right. If I want to count, like, I want to optimize my table after there were 42 writes, then I can count the number of changes to that table. That's a different story then. I need to keep track what the client is doing. Is the client still alive? Has it been decommissioned? I'm just filling up disk space, whatever. So that's way more complicated, and it gets into the territory of basically distributed transactions, which is distributed systems transactions are TLDR nightmare.
Yep. Okay. So Christian, it sounds like you'll take the lead on writing something up as a proposal. Robert's latest thoughts are probably pretty helpful in like informing that design, and we can pick this up next time. Thank you, and sorry to distract immediately on something that wasn't on the agenda, but I appreciate the discussion.
So maybe going backwards, just touching on the auth manager APIs and everything, I think we're actually super close. And I at this point, I'm just waiting for the 1.8 release, because the last thing we want to do is like end up with an RC and then drop this in the 1.8. So I think we're just going to hold off on that. We'll do the final pass on the auth manager stuff, and it'll be great to get that in. I do think that we have some follow-up things that we identified. These were like pre-existing problems, before. So there's still a little bit of work to make sure that we have like vendor credential refresh is one of the ones that we noticed. Like we have vendor credential refresh, but it's bound to the life of whatever the token is. And so we need to fix that, where we fixed that issue in other areas. And then we also possibly need to look at that in context of like the SIG v4 and how that works with some of the places where we're using that. So.
Yes, also as a follow-up, I guess if this is all done, at least I wanted to take over Rust. We also need Python, and we should migrate the approach.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there was some discussion, I don't know if it was Christian or Alex that mentioned like writing up a kind of how to do security right for clients or
Yeah, I think we can take a pass at the REST spec, because right now it kind of assumes whatever authentication is needed that it's going to be OAuth, so it's kind of hard coded. So yeah, there's probably a pass to be done there.
Yeah, I'm conflicted on that, because like the way that the Open API like specification is written right now is like, we're providing a spec for people to implement. We're not detailing how it is implemented in a particular system, which is actually how the Open API is like geared to be able to expose their security stuff. So I think like Robert's suggestion was like, yeah, let's remove that stuff from the Open API spec. And I think that that's what we're headed to with the deprecations. So then the question is like, is there a way to model that either internally or externally in a way that actually makes sense between what we're defining in the spec and not like necessarily telling people you have to implement this thing, which was part of the argument.
There is a way to do that in Open API. In Open API, you can say which types of authentication you support. So right now we have something that says it allows bearer auth and OAuth, and we don't need to give the details of bearer auth or OAuth, and we can add other flavors as well. Like SigD4 should have been in there because I believe we support it in the library, and just point to those specifications. Again, like you're saying, Dan, we don't need to explain how to do it, but we can point to these things are generally accepted and allowed, or maybe even supported by clients. Yeah.
So the challenge there, just to respond quickly, is they are pretty specific about some of the security things. Like SigD4 is not even part of it the last time that I looked, because they have specific ones that they do enumerate. And also the way that you write the spec is dictating what was implemented as opposed to what options do you have to implement. So it's like the way that we're using OpenAPI here is not quite in line with the way that OpenAPI is intended to like detail a built spec. We're providing this as a template for people to use. So it just gets a little awkward there. I think it was Robert and then Christian.
Other way around, Christian first.
Christian.
Yeah, just a few words. So first of all, yeah, the authentication guide, how I called it, is, well, we decided in the last meetup in December that this is something that we cannot discuss in this round, and I need to push it again into the bigger round, and we should discuss it as part of the general Iceberg sync, and not just the catalog sync, because this kind of affects the whole ecosystem. So I still need to tackle that. Haven't found time yet. So that's first comment. Second comment. I think we should take a stronger stance on what authentication mechanisms clients should implement. The reason for that is that Iceberg is all about interoperability. And if people decide that, and of course, I mean, we have the Java implementation, but there are many other implementations as well. And all of these implementations need to decide what authentication mechanisms to implement. And we currently have two main methods how we can implement, and this is OAuth and SigD4. And I think we should highlight that in the doc. We can still leave it open for others to extend, but we need to take the stance, because a common specification without a common authentication is worthless, right? If someone implements the REST specification and decides to use, I don't know, Kerberos or something like that, then almost no client is going to be able to connect to it, right? And like, we as the standardizing people around Iceberg, that's at least my opinion, should kind of highlight that we have these two main methods of authenticating, and clients should implement it. So right now, if we look at clients written in other languages that don't use the Java library, but actually also some that use the Java library, they don't implement SigD4. Probably they should. They implement just a few OAuth flows, not all of them. So, and I think by taking a stronger stance to saying, well, if you want to connect to REST catalog, these are the two ways that we recommend, it would be valuable for the ecosystem. So, yeah, that's my point. Robert?
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, personally, I think we should leave out authorization details entirely from the spec. Because, as I said, there's OAuth that way. Not everything supports every OAuth flow. I think verbally saying something like, we recommend to implement OAuth, like you have some, your external key cloak or whatever. We also recommend having SigD4 maybe. But that leaves the door open if someone really wants to implement Kerberos, right? If someone wants to go down that rabbit hole, hey, okay, do that. You can have it pluggable with the auth manager. If you're on the client side, you have to implement your server the right way. You could also go the other way around and say, okay, for a prototype, I don't need authorization at all, and just go anonymous. Oh, and just wanted to add, encoding that in an OpenAPI spec. I think that's what Dan is also want to get to, is it's more or less what's in Iceberg in the source code base is more or less a template. You have to rebuild the OpenAPI YAML for every server individually with the exact details that it supports.
And I think that there is actually somebody out there who supports Kerberos. So.
Oh shit.
Well, and there are also other things, like we were just talking to Netflix, and they have mutually authenticated SSL, and that they're working on support for. So I agree that we want to be like, we want to let people know what is probably going to work the best. That's why I would honestly keep it to what is currently there, which is the like authentication schemes as pointers to other things, right? We know that SigB4 is being used. We know that OAuth is being used. Clearly, like bearer tokens are possible. So like, point to some things, and if someone wants to get a Kerberos implementation into the Apache reference implementation, good luck, because I don't want to review it. But like they should be able to do that, and then we can update the spec to say like, hey, some implementations use and support Kerberos.
But I don't think it's wrong for us to actually take a strong stance and say we strongly recommend that you support OAuth, as
Yes.
we provide out of the box client implementations for that. And I don't think we want to step over the line of like you must use it or you must not use other things, but we want to strongly recommend things that are supported by the reference implementation.
I agree with that.
Cool. Seems we have some level of consensus on this topic. Just want to coordinate to see if there's any other topics anyone want to bring up.
We can step back one before this for the remove schemas REST update. I just think it's an important thing to note that this is one of those areas where we're adding an update and we don't actually have a good way to signal whether a service supports that update or not. In this case, we can hide it behind a procedure call that is not the default behavior, but if a client were to automatically start producing like remove schema updates, then the requirement from the REST spec is that you fail the update. You fail to commit if you can't support the update type.
I would also mention, at least here, that these updates did not exist at first because we don't think this is a client problem. This is something that the catalog should be responsible for.
Yes, the catalog should be responsible for these things. I think it's notable in the sense that like we added the capabilities endpoints, but it technically doesn't cover this type of change. In this case, I think it's something that we can manage, but we should be on the lookout for like if we introduce other updates or if there's something else. It could result in incompatibility for older versions or older servers that don't understand those updates. And if clients are producing them by default, it could limit their ability to interact with tables. And maybe when it becomes pressing, we can think of ways to address that. But
when would currently the Spark implementation send this update?
If you run the procedure for, which one is it?
It's expire snapshots with an additional option to clean out old specs and schemas. So this is not something that happens automatically. I don't even know that we've plumbed it through into the, this is a feature that did not need to exist for the first 7 years of the project. So it's, like we're only adding it here for completeness of the REST specification. The intent is that, as a catalog goes through and expires snapshots, it automatically sets this flag and, has this capability. not that you would ever do it on a client. But if you set it on the client because you have your own your own way of doing this, you need to make sure that the service supports it.
And the main scenario that this has come up is like using the Kafka Connect with like the dynamic schema evolution or automatic schema evolution, where the objects coming in are not the shape that you expected them to be, and it blows up your schema space. We've had cases where it's like every row creates a new schema as it's coming in. And as you can imagine, your table metadata blows up very quickly. And if you even have like a short period where something like that's happening, like correcting for that is really hard at that point because there's no way to remove those schemas from the table metadata. So.
Okay, thanks.
I've also got one more topic, sort of bringing things back out of our backlog. I'm wondering if there's still interest in working on SQL UDFs. This has been coming up in some of the discussions I've been having on authorizations and expressing authorization decisions through the REST API. I think SQL UDFs can be used to extend quite a bit of the language and are a good way to also have a pretty explicit flag about whether something simple versus complex is supported. So, a SQL UDF can have arbitrary complexity, but we would not necessarily need to support arbitrary complexity in other places in the API. So it could be a really good thing for that. In general, there are also people interested, I know, in sharing SQL UDFs across implementations. So is there interest here in pushing this forward and working with the community, Yufei?
Yeah, I think we are interested in this as well. So one of the use case I'm thinking about is the access control. When we talking about a finer grained access control, like role filtering, as well as column masking, the UDF is very important. If we have a kind of a standardized SQL UDF, then it becomes interoperable across multiple catalogs as well as across multiple engines. So that the policy itself will be in much better position in that sense, because we have a standard to leverage on based on to build the policy, use certain standardized UDF.
Mm-hmm.
Question I'm trying to, like very basic question, because I don't have much context for the SQL UDF. Are we gonna, I think I'm just imagining potentially we wanna store this UDF in the catalog. And another question is, how do we resolve the dialects, SQL dialects?
So I think the idea would be to do the same thing that we did for views, which is to have SQL multi-dialect, UDF as one of the potential representations. I think that's what was proposed by Ajantha before.
Is what I want to say, Ariane. I think we have already a proposal on the main list.
Yeah, but
about
the proposal when we reviewed it, I don't think got updated. So
sure.
There were some things that we wanted to fix in the proposal to make it behave like SQL views and things like that. So I'm wondering, is there appetite for going back and updating that proposal, writing a new one based on that as a historical point? Do we want to carry this work forward? I think the initial work would be to start supporting UDFs with a SQL representation in catalog and update that in the REST catalog spec. Then we can build on that to get to exactly what you're talking about, Yufei. The ability to use those in either filters or transformations as like projections, right? Because if you want to do like column masking, you would send a transformation back to the client.
Yeah, that would be super cool. I'm still worried a little bit about that. That's because that's when we split into the multiple form, then there's no guarantee they express the exact same meaning of the like it's a little bit messy, and every time we have a new engine, because essentially it's not quite interoperable. If we write in multiple dialects per engine, we still have to adapt every time this new engine come up or new engine joins the force, like one or two. To get that, then we have to write a new one.
Yeah, and I think that this is the area where before we said, let's start with SQL because there's enough that's expressible as cross-engine SQL that we can, make a lot of progress, and then follow up with, some sort of IR, which is why we have the ability to have multiple representations, right? So eventually, I think we will have some IR. There's a lot of issues getting an intermediate representation in, simply because of the opinions across the industry about what that IR might look like. But I think we can make a lot of progress with SQL and the multi-dialect stuff that we've already done.
Yeah, I would envision this could be averaging process if we support a multi-cycle +1 IR, which is come up over time, become very popular when people like different engine or support that. Then every engine can just use that, and then other dialects will basically become a little bit useless in that sense. This is potential a way forward. I'm not quite sure, but I'm just envisioning this is potential way forward.
Mm-hmm.
I was about to say substrate, and JB mentioned it. So from my experience with substrate, especially when you have scalar functions and all, it is really impossible to get consistency across engines. And with RLS, I'm just wondering, like, do people really create such complex filters for enforcing low-level security? Because with security, we should probably support something which, like as we discussed earlier, for authorization, we said this is what we recommend. Similarly, for RLS, also something we can really guarantee that might be better than introducing scalar functions and UDFs for security purpose.
So UDFs are fairly widely used for security already, which I think is what makes them somewhat attractive here. It's also something where you can easily detect, like, do I support a function call that is, custom or a UDF in this context or not, versus like previous suggestions have been to just pass back SQL strings, which I think doesn't have the long-term flexibility that we need in order to evolve to eventually having an IR when we can agree on one and things like that. I agree with you. Like, it's very, very, very complicated to do this in Substrate.
What happened is, like, even like with Substrate, especially there's a concept called extensions. And the extensions extensively used for introducing functions which are specific to some engines and not common. And that's the most widely popular, most popular feature. Everyone just writes extension because they don't have to care about what other engines will think about, how the overflows are handled, how the errors are handled.
And that was the original one of the original points of pushback that we heard about Substrate. When we talked about using Substrate in the past, it was, well, Substrate allows anyone to specify their overflow behavior. Like, so now I've got to support 3 overflow behaviors just to, add something together in an expression. And if I've got to do that, then, I'm not going to support half of them. And so are we really, exchanging a SQL plan that we agree on? Which I think is a fair criticism of it. And again, like, I think the path forward is probably to be able to introduce an IR later, multiple IRs later, be able to do this and evolve the spec, but to, make progress today. Because, like, right now, what people would do is go take the same SQL text. The situation with views that we had was people will take the same SQL text and paste it in multiple places, and we can at least do better than that.
Since this is recorded, I just want to record. I'll mention that Substrate still is very powerful, and we at Microsoft, we are using it for interoperability across engines. So it is, there are challenges, but it is, I think, right now the best option available. So I'm a big supporter of it. It's just that I'm aware of the challenges also with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like there is some interest out there. Yufei, are you interested in running with the spec update or the proposal doc, or do we want to see if Ajantha wants to update his?
Oh, the original author is Ajantha, right? If I understand correctly.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Okay. I can work with Ajantha. Let me check with Ajantha, and I can try to come up with something. I think if everybody, it looks like we have agreements on kind of API adding into the REST spec, which is great. We should get this proposal out. And thanks. I volunteer to work with Ajantha for that.
Awesome. Any other topics?
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. Yeah, thanks. If not, I think we can end this meeting about like 30 minutes earlier to get everyone 30 minutes back. Thanks for joining. The recording will be uploaded shortly. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.